The wagon groaned to a halt, its final complaint a long, weary sigh of wood and iron that seemed to echo Clara's own exhausted spirit. For weeks, that sound had been the rhythm of her life, a constant reminder of the relentless, punishing journey westward. But now, it was over. They had arrived. This was not a town, not really. It was a wound in the vast, white hide of the Montana Territory, a ragged collection of log buildings huddled together against a wind that had teeth. Smoke clawed its way from mud and stick chimneys, only to be torn apart and scattered by the gales. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, promising more snow to a world already buried in it. Men in heavy coats and fur hats moved with the stooped, hurried gait of those who understood the cold not as a season, but as an enemy. They had carried her husband, Thomas, from the wagon an hour ago. He had been a thin man to begin with, a clerk from Ohio with soft hands and a cough that had worried his mother. He had filled his letters to Clara with talk of opportunity, of a new life under a wide-open sky, of a homestead that would make them prosperous. He had never mentioned the cold. He had never mentioned the sickness that would hollow out his lungs and turn his promises to dust somewhere in the Dakota plains. Clara had not wept. The feeling inside her was not grief, not yet. It was a profound and terrifying emptiness, a hollowness where a future was supposed to be. She had married Thomas after a courtship of letters, a practical arrangement for a girl with no dowry and few prospects. He was to be her provider, her protector, the sturdy post around which she would build a life. She had tried to feel affection, had practiced in her mind the duties of a wife, but she had known him for only the 6 weeks of this brutal journey. He had been a stranger, and now he was a memory that belonged to someone else. She was a widow before she had ever truly been a wife. A large man with a beard like frosted moss, the wagon master, approached her. His eyes held a rough pity, but his voice was impatient. "Ma'am," he said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "The doctor said it was consumption. Nothing to be done. We'll see to the burying. But the wagon, I need the wagon." Clara nodded, her body numb. She climbed down, her worn wool skirt catching on a splinter. She owned nothing but the 2 trunks inside that wagon and the clothes on her back. The money Thomas had brought was almost gone, spent on tinctures and blankets that had done nothing to stop the inevitable. She stood alone as they unloaded her trunks, dropping them into the muddy, frozen slush beside the settlement's largest building, a trading post and saloon in one. People watched her, from the dark doorways of cabins, from the saloon's grimy windows. Faces peered out. She saw no welcome in their eyes. She saw curiosity, the kind one gives a stray dog that wanders into camp, a flicker of pity, quickly followed by suspicion. She was an outsider, a woman alone, and she had arrived with death. A woman in a drab brown shawl clutched a small child's hand and pulled him back into a doorway as Clara looked her way, as if the shadow of loss might be contagious. Another man, leaning against a post and spitting tobacco juice that froze almost instantly upon hitting the ground, muttered something to his companion. The words were lost to the wind, but the tone was clear. She was an omen. Bad luck. Clara pulled her thin cloak tighter, her gaze fixed on her trunks, as if they were the last 2 rocks in a world that had become a churning sea. Where was she to go? Thomas had spoken of a parcel of land he had purchased, sight unseen. It was miles from here. He had said, but she had no map, no horse, no knowledge of this hard, frozen country. She had nothing. The door to the general store creaked open, and a man with spectacles and a kind, worried face beckoned her inside. He was the shopkeeper, a Mr. Abernathy. The air inside was thick with the smells of leather, coffee, and wood smoke. It was warm, and the sudden change made her dizzy. "Come in, missus," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Come by the stove." She obeyed, her legs unsteady. She stood over the pot-bellied stove, stretching her trembling, gloveless hands toward its heat. Her fingers were white and stiff, like a doll's. "I heard about your husband, Mr. Abernathy said, polishing a glass jar with a soft cloth, his eyes averted. "A terrible thing. A terrible journey to make in winter." Clara could only nod. Words felt like stones in her throat. "You have people here? Family?" he asked gently. "No, sir," she whispered. Her voice was thin, unfamiliar. "I have no one." The shopkeeper sighed and set the jar down. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and filled with a weary compassion. He had seen this before. He had seen the frontier chew up and spit out people with brighter hopes than hers. "The folks here, they can be a bit wary," he said, choosing his words with care. "They've had a hard winter, sickness, a woman arriving alone, with, well, they don't mean no harm, but they ain't likely to open their doors." "I understand," Clara said, though she did not. How could a person's heart grow so cold? "You have money for a room at the saloon?" She shook her head, a slow, shameful motion. "Very little. Enough for food for a few days. Perhaps not for lodging." He chewed on his lip, his brow furrowed in thought. He glanced around the empty store, then leaned closer across the counter. "There is a place," he said, his voice barely audible. "But it's a long way out, west of here, toward the mountains. A man lives out there. Callum Hayes." Clara looked at him, waiting. "He keeps to himself," the shopkeeper continued. "Has a small cabin, a few horses, traps a little. He don't come to town much. Folks here have stories about him. Say he's strange. Some say he's dangerous. But I've dealt with the man for 5 years. He's always been square with me. Quiet, but decent. I think he's just a man who's been hurt by the world and wants it to leave him be." Desperation was a cold, sharp thing. It made a person consider paths they would otherwise never dream of walking. "Why do you tell me this?" Clara asked. "Because you've got nowhere to go," Mr. Abernathy said simply. "And I reckon a man who chooses to live that far from other people might not mind the company of one more. Or he might be the one man in this territory who understands what it is to be alone." He paused, then added, "He won't suffer a fool. I can tell you that. But he's not an evil man. I'd stake my store on it." The shopkeeper looked at her threadbare cloak and worn-out boots. "I can't offer you a horse, but Jed, out back. He has a mule he might lend you for a day's food. Her name is Delilah. She's stubborn, but she knows the trail west better than any man here." An hour later, Clara was leading the mule out of the settlement. Mr. Abernathy had given her a small parcel of dried beef and a heel of bread, refusing her last few coins. He had pointed the way, a faint track, nearly invisible under the fresh layer of snow. "Follow the creek bed west," he'd instructed. "You'll see the smoke from his chimney before you see the cabin. It's nestled in a stand of pines at the foot of the ridge. You cannot miss it." The world beyond the last cabin was a vast, silent expanse of white. The snow was deeper here, swallowing the sound of her own footsteps, the plodding clop of the mule's hooves. The wind was a physical presence, a predator that tore at her cloak and stung her cheeks until they were raw and burning. The cold seeped through the soles of her boots, through the layers of her clothing, sinking deep into her bones. She walked for hours. The pewter sky never changed. The landscape was a repeating canvas of snow-laden pines, frozen creeks, and the immense, indifferent silence of the wilderness. There was no sign of life, no bird, no rabbit, just the ghostly dance of snow devils whipped up by the wind. The hollow ache inside her began to solidify into something else, a cold, hard knot of fear. What was she doing? Walking into an endless winter, seeking shelter from a man the world called strange, a man who lived alone for reasons no one seemed to know. Thomas had been her shield against this kind of terror, however flimsy a shield he might have been. Now there was nothing between her and the raw, brutal heart of this land. Her thoughts grew sluggish, numbed by the cold. She thought of her mother's garden in Ohio, of the scent of damp earth and roses. She thought of the warmth of a kitchen, the steam rising from a cup of tea. These images were like ghosts from another life, another world. They had no place here. She stumbled, her ankle twisting in a hidden drift. The mule, Delilah, stopped and looked back at her with large, dark, patient eyes. Clara pushed herself up, her hands burning from the snow. She had to keep moving. To stop was to die. It was as simple as that. The light began to fail, the world softening into shades of gray and deep blue. Mr. Abernathy had said she would see the smoke. She scanned the horizon, her eyes aching, but saw nothing but the endless ranks of pine trees marching up the dark slopes of the mountains. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She was lost. He had been wrong. There was no cabin. There was nothing but this. She leaned against the mule's flank, the animal's coarse hair and surprising warmth a small comfort. Her own breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She was so tired. It would be so easy to just lie down, to close her eyes and let the snow cover her like a blanket. The thought was not frightening. It was seductive, a final, peaceful surrender. But then, through the moan of the wind, she saw it, a faint gray wisp of smoke, almost indistinguishable from the swirling snow, rising from a dense clutch of pines a quarter-mile ahead. Hope, or something like it, gave her a last surge of strength. She pushed away from the mule and began to walk again, her legs moving mechanically. Each step was a battle. The cabin was a distant dream, a promise of warmth that seemed to recede with every footfall. The snow was deeper here, clutching at her skirts, pulling her down. She was perhaps 100 yards from the trees when her strength finally gave out. Her legs buckled beneath her. She did not even cry out. She simply fell, a quiet collapse into the deep. Soft white. The world tilted, the dark shapes of the pines spinning against the darkening sky. Her last conscious thought was of the cold, a deep and profound cold that was no longer outside her, but had finally found its way in. He found her just as the last of the light bled from the sky. Callum Hayes had been checking his trap lines when he saw the mule, standing stock still and patient, a dark shape against the snow. He did not recognize it. Visitors were a rarity he neither encouraged nor welcomed. His hand went instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. Then he saw the tracks, small and scuffed, leading to the dark mound in the snow. He approached with caution, his movements silent and sure. It was a woman. Her face was turned to the side, pale as porcelain, framed by dark hair dusted with snow. She was small, swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking down at her. A strange and unwelcome complication dropped at his doorstep. He knelt, pulling off a thick leather glove. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. The skin was like ice, but beneath it, he felt a pulse, a faint, thready flutter. She was alive. With a low grunt of effort, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile bundle of cold wool and colder flesh. He carried her toward the cabin, the mule following behind without being told. The warm, yellow light from his window spilled out onto the snow, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, laying her gently on the bearskin rug in front of the stone fireplace. The cabin was a single room, spare and clean. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed was built into one wall, a cot folded against the other. Shelves held a few books, tin plates, and jars of preserves. It was the home of a man who needed little and wanted less. Callum worked with an economy of motion. He stoked the fire until it roared, then filled a kettle with water from a bucket by the door and set it on the hearth to warm. He gently removed her frozen cloak and her sodden, useless boots. One of them had a long tear along the seam. He set them aside, He chafed her hands between his own large, calloused ones, his touch surprisingly gentle, until some color returned to her fingers. He did all this without a word, his expression unreadable, his focus absolute. He was like a man tending to an injured animal, his actions driven by a practical, unsentimental sense of duty. When she finally stirred, it was with a low moan. Her eyelids fluttered open. She was looking at a ceiling of rough-hewn logs, dark with smoke and age. The air smelled of pine and burning wood and something else, something clean and masculine, like leather and winter air. She felt a profound, bone-deep warmth, a sensation so foreign and so welcome it almost made her weep. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. A hand, large and steady, pressed gently on her shoulder. "Easy now," a voice said. It was a low, rough voice, like gravel stirred in a deep well. She turned her head. A man was kneeling beside her, in the flickering firelight. She could see he was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his flannel shirt. His hair was dark and longish, his face angular and weathered by sun and wind. There were lines around his eyes the color of a stormy sky. It was a hard face, a solitary face, but there was no menace in it, only a quiet watchfulness. "Where?" she began, her voice a dry rasp. "My cabin," he said. "You collapsed in the snow. I brought you in." The memory returned in a rush. The cold, the falling darkness, the utter despair. She pushed herself up, ignoring the spinning in her head, her pride. The last tattered remnant of the person she used to be flared to life. "I am sorry," she said, her words stiff. "I did not mean to trespass. I will leave." She tried to stand, but her legs were water. She would have fallen if he had not caught her arm. His grip was firm, but not unkind. "You'll do no such thing," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not in this cold. Not tonight." He helped her to one of the chairs by the table and handed her a tin mug of warm water. She wrapped her frozen fingers around it, letting the heat sink in. She looked around the small cabin, at its stark simplicity. This was the home of Callum Hayes, the strange, decent man. "The shopkeeper, Mr. Abernathy. He told me," she started, trying to explain, trying to justify her presence. Callum cut her off with a slight shake of his head. "No need for talk. You were freezing. Now you're not. That's all that matters tonight." He moved away from her, turning his attention to a pot simmering over the fire. He worked in silence, and his silence was not awkward. It was a solid, comfortable thing, like the stone of the fireplace or the thick log walls of the cabin. It asked nothing of her. Clara watched him, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a profound exhaustion. He was a large man, and his presence filled the small room, yet he moved with a quiet grace. He was not what she had expected. She did not know what she had expected, but it was not this quiet, contained gentleness. He ladled a thick stew into a bowl and set it before her, along with a piece of dark bread. "Eat," he said. It was not a request. She ate. The stew was simple, venison and root vegetables, but it was hot and nourishing. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. With each spoonful, she felt life seeping back into her, pushing back the cold that had taken root in her soul. When she was finished, he took the bowl without a word. He unfolded the cot and placed it on the other side of the hearth, a respectable distance from his own built-in bed. He laid a thick wool blanket over it. "You can sleep here," he said, gesturing to the cot. "It's the warmest spot." Clara looked at the simple cot, at the roaring fire, at this quiet stranger who had saved her life, overwhelmed. She felt tears welling in her eyes for the first time since Thomas had taken his last breath. They were not tears of grief, but of a desperate, humbling gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate. I will leave in the morning. I will not be a burden." Callum was looking into the fire, his back to her. "We'll see what the morning brings," he said, his voice low. "Sleep now." She lay down on the cot, pulling the heavy blanket up to her chin. The wool was rough against her skin, but it was warm. She watched his broad silhouette as he sat at the table, cleaning his knife with a slow, methodical patience. He did not look at her. He seemed content in his own world, a world he had allowed her to enter for just a little while. For the first time in months, she felt safe. She was a widow, a pauper, a stranger stranded at the edge of the world. But tonight she was warm. She was sheltered. And in the quiet solitude of this cabin, tended to by a man who asked no questions, she finally slept, a deep and dreamless sleep, while the Montana winter raged outside. The next morning, Clara awoke to the smell of coffee and the quiet crackle of the fire. The storm had passed. Sunlight, pale and thin, streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Callum was not there. His bed was neatly made, and a pot of coffee was warming on the hearth. She sat up, feeling stiff but rested. Her clothes, which had been damp and frozen, were now dry, folded neatly on the chair beside her, and next to them, her boots. She picked one up. The long, gaping tear along the seam was gone. In its place was a line of small, tight stitches, a repair so neat and strong it was barely visible. The leather had been treated with some kind of oil, making it supple again. Clara ran her finger over the careful handiwork. He had done this while she slept. He had seen her broken boot, a small symbol of her larger, more desperate state, and he had mended it. He had not mentioned it. He had not offered sympathy or asked how it had happened. He had simply seen a thing that was broken and made it whole again. She held the boot in her lap, a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. In this small, silent act of service, this quiet mending, she felt the first fragile seed of trust being planted in the frozen ground of her heart. She did not know this man. She did not know his past or why he chose to live this way. But she knew this. He was a man who fixed what was broken without ever needing to say a word. The days settled into a quiet, fragile rhythm, dictated by the sun and the snow. Clara, driven by a deep-seated need not to be a useless mouth to feed, tried to find her place in the cabin's small world. She was determined to contribute, to earn the warmth of the fire and the food she was given. But the work of this life was foreign to her hands. She tried to help with the cooking, but her attempts were clumsy. The vegetables were unevenly chopped, the dough for the bread too sticky or too dry. She had been raised to keep a tidy townhouse, to practice needlepoint and arrange flowers. She knew nothing of stretching a meager ration of flour to last a week, or of rendering fat from a freshly killed rabbit. Her movements were hesitant, her brow perpetually furrowed in concentration, a stark contrast to Callum's effortless competence. He never criticized her, never pointed out her mistakes. He would simply take the knife from her hand and, with a few swift motions, finish the task she had struggled with for a quarter of an hour. His silence, she thought, was more damning than any reprimand. It was the silence of a man who expected nothing from her, and she longed to prove him wrong. She took to mending. This, at least, she understood. She repaired the tears in his flannel shirts with tiny, neat stitches, her needle a small and familiar comfort in her fingers. She darned his wool socks, her head bent low over her work, her hair falling forward to hide her face. It was a way to feel useful, a way to repay his kindness in a language she knew. She would watch him from the corner of her eye as he pulled on a mended shirt, her heart giving a small, anxious leap, waiting for some sign of approval. He never gave one. He simply wore the shirt. It seems now stronger than before, and she had to be content with that. Callum's days were spent outside, in the biting cold. He moved with a relentless purpose, a man at war with the stillness of winter, from dawn until dusk. The rhythmic thud of his axe echoed from the woods as he chopped firewood, stacking it in a neat, towering wall against the cabin. He tended his 2 horses with a quiet reverence, brushing their coats until they shone, his low voice a constant, soothing murmur in the stables. He would disappear for hours to check his trap lines, returning with a brace of rabbits or a fox slung over his shoulder, his face impassive, his clothes smelling of pine and frost. He was a man made of silence. His work was his language, his actions his only conversation. He seemed to exist entirely in the present moment, in the physical reality of his tasks. He rarely looked at her directly, his gaze always fixed on his work, on the horizon, on anything but the woman who now shared his small, solitary space. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence began to fray at the edges. It started with simple things. "More coffee?" she would ask, her voice barely a whisper. A nod. "Thank you. The snow looks deep today." "It is." These small exchanges were like stones dropped into a deep well. The splash was small, but the ripples spread through the long hours of quiet. One evening, as she was cleaning the pewter plates, she found the courage to ask more. Mr. Abernathy said you were a rancher once," she said, her back to him. She could feel his stillness behind her. For a long moment, he said nothing, and she feared she had overstepped, that the fragile truce between them was broken. "A foreman," he said finally, his voice rough. "At the Double Horn, down south." "It must have been a fine place," she ventured, daring to glance over her shoulder. He was staring into the fire, his expression lost in memory. "It was," he said. "Good land, good horses." "Why did you leave?" The question was out before she could stop it. It was too bold, too prying. She turned back to her task, her cheeks burning. He was silent for so long this time that she was certain he would not answer. She heard him shift in his chair. "There was a misunderstanding," he said, his voice flat and hard. "The owner accused me of stealing cattle, said I was selling off his stock on the sly." Clara stopped her work, her hands still in the soapy water. She turned to face him fully. "But you did not," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. She could not imagine this man, so fiercely honorable in his own quiet way, being a thief. A muscle tightened in his jaw. "The town believed he did. That's all that matters." "But it is not the truth," she insisted. "You could have told them." He finally looked at her, his stormy eyes meeting hers for the first time with a direct, searing intensity. "Some things ain't worth explaining, ma'am," he said, his voice low and final. "A man's word is all he has. If they do not believe that, then there is nothing else to say. I do not need their pity." He stood then and walked to the door, pulling on his heavy coat. He went outside into the frigid night, choosing the punishing cold over the warmth of a fire shared with her questions. Clara stood by the table, her heart aching for him. He chose silence over sympathy, isolation over the risk of being misunderstood again. She understood then that his quiet was not emptiness. It was a fortress, built stone by stone to protect a wound that had never healed. A few nights later, the terrors of her journey caught up with her. In the deep, dark hours of the night, she dreamt she was back in the wagon, the air thick with sickness and the smell of death. Thomas was beside her, his face pale and waxy, his breath a shallow, rattling sound. But then the face changed. It was a man she did not know. A cruel face from the streets of the settlement, his eyes filled with suspicion and contempt. He was whispering that she was bad luck, that she had brought death with her. His hand reached for her, cold and heavy. "Stop!" she cried out in her sleep, the word a choked, desperate plea. "Please stop!" She thrashed on the small cot, tangling herself in the rough wool blanket. The sound of her own voice woke her. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs, her skin slick with a cold sweat. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. The cabin was silent, but she felt a presence. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom. He was standing by the door, a tall, dark silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the window. He was not moving, just standing there, watching. I am sorry, she stammered, her voice shaking. A bad dream. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He just remained at his post by the door. A silent sentinel. She realized he must have been standing there for some time, keeping watch over her while she slept. He was not intruding on her fear, not offering empty words of comfort. He was simply guarding the space around her, holding the darkness at bay with his quiet, steady presence. It was the most profound gesture of protection she had ever known. She lay back down, pulling the blanket tight, and though she did not sleep again for a long time, she was no longer afraid. She could feel his watchfulness from across the room, a silent promise that she was not alone in the night. The next morning, the world was gone. A blizzard had descended while they slept, burying the landscape in a swirling, howling vortex of white. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, and snow piled in deep drifts against the door and window. They were trapped. For 3 days, the storm raged. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The constant, close proximity was a thing of its own, a palpable presence in the room. The space that had once seemed manageable now felt intensely small. They moved around each other in a careful, silent dance, their arms sometimes brushing as they passed, sending a jolt of awareness through Clara's body. The silences grew heavier, filled with unspoken thoughts, shared glances, once fleeting, now lingered for a moment too long. She would look up from her mending and find him watching her, his expression unreadable, before he quickly looked away. He would be cleaning a rifle, his large hands surprisingly deft, and he would pause, his gaze resting on her as she read from the single, worn book of poems on his shelf. In these moments, the air between them grew thick, charged with a tension that was both frightening and exhilarating. By the 4th day, Clara was out of clean clothes. She had washed her dress and underthings as best she could, but in the damp, cold air of the cabin, they refused to dry completely. She was left with nothing to wear but the clothes she stood in, now grimy and worn. The shame of it was a hot flush on her cheeks. That evening, Callum noticed her discomfort. She saw his eyes flicker to the still damp dress hanging by the fire. He said nothing, but after their meager supper, he went to the small chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it and pulled out a shirt of soft, gray flannel. It was worn, but clean. He held it out to her. "Here," he said, his voice low. He did not meet her eyes. Clara stared at the offered shirt. It was an act of profound intimacy, a crossing of a line she had not even been aware existed. To wear a man's shirt, his shirt, it was unthinkable. But the alternative, her own soiled clothes, was a humiliation she could not bear. Her hands trembled as she reached out and took it from him. The flannel was soft and heavy in her grasp. It smelled faintly of him, of wood smoke, pine, and clean, cold air. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. She waited until he was occupied with sharpening his knife, his back to her, before she quickly changed behind the flimsy cover of a blanket she hung over a chair. The shirt swallowed her. The sleeves hung down past her fingertips, and the hem fell to her knees. Like a dress, it was ridiculously large, yet it felt like a shield, the warmth of the fabric, a warmth that seemed to hold a trace of his own, enveloped her. It was the most comforting thing she had felt in years. When she emerged from behind the blanket, he did not look up, but she saw the muscles in his shoulders tense, a silent acknowledgement of the change that had just passed between them. The storm broke on the 5th day. The sun came out, blindingly bright on the new fallen snow. The world was pristine, silent, and clean. The tension in the cabin seemed to break with it. That morning, Clara was trying to make cornbread in a heavy iron skillet over the fire, distracted by a noise outside. She left it on the heat for a moment too long. A smell of burning filled the cabin. She snatched the skillet off the fire, her face a mask of dismay. The bottom of the cornbread was black as charcoal. "Oh, no," she murmured, her shoulders slumping in defeat. It was yet another failure, another sign of her uselessness. Callum came over to inspect the damage. He poked at the blackened crust with the tip of his knife. She expected him to be annoyed, to sigh in frustration at the wasted food. Instead, a low sound rumbled in his chest. He looked at her flour-smudged nose and her crestfallen expression, and he smiled. It was not a large smile, just a slight upturning of the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his hard face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. And then he laughed. It was a quiet, rusty sound, as if from long disuse, but it was a genuine laugh. The unexpected sound of it was so startling that Clara found herself smiling back, and then a giggle escaped her lips, a light, girlish sound she had not heard from herself in years. The absurdity of it all, the storm, the confinement, the burnt offering for breakfast, struck her as funny. Soon, she was laughing too, her laughter mingling with his in the sunlit cabin. They ate the less burnt edges of the cornbread, and for the first time, they were not just two strangers sharing a roof. They were two people sharing a joke. It was a small thing, a moment of shared levity, but it felt momentous. It was a promise that even in the midst of a hard and lonely winter, there could be warmth, there could be laughter. In the quiet days that followed, Clara found a new way to cope with the maelstrom of emotions inside her. She began to write. Callum had a small stash of paper and a bottle of ink, and he did not object when she asked to use them. She would sit at the table for hours, the pen clutched in her fingers, and pour her heart out onto the page. She did not know who she was writing to. Sometimes it was to her mother, long dead. Sometimes it was to the girl she had been in Ohio, a girl who had never imagined a life like this. She wrote of her fear, her confusion, her profound loneliness. She wrote of the crushing weight of a grief for a life she had never even wanted. And, hesitantly, she wrote about Callum. She wrote about his silence, his kindness, the way he mended her boot, the way he stood guard over her nightmares. She tried to make sense of the feelings he stirred in her, gratitude, fear, and a strange, fluttering hope that felt as fragile as a butterfly's wing. One afternoon, while Clara was outside gathering firewood from the great stack Callum had built, he came back inside to fetch a whetstone. The wind had caught one of her letters, blowing it from the table onto the floor. He bent to pick it up, meaning only to place it back on the table, but his eyes caught the first few lines, written in her neat, careful hand. "My dearest mother, I do not know if you can hear me in heaven, but I have never felt so alone. I am in a place that is as hard and as cold as the moon. I am living in the cabin of the man who saved me. He is a good man, I think, but he is so quiet. His silence is a wall, and I do not know how to breach it. I fear I am nothing more than a stray he has taken in, another broken thing to be mended and then forgotten. He is kind, but it is the kindness one shows to a wounded bird. He does not see me as a woman. How could he? I am a widow who does not mourn, a bride who was never a wife. I am nothing." Callum stopped reading, his throat tight. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back on the table, exactly where it had been. He turned and left the cabin, his heart a heavy, aching weight in his chest. He had thought he was offering her shelter, a safe place to heal. He had not realized that his silence, his fortress, was also her prison. He had not understood the depth of her despair, or the profound shame she carried. For the first time in years, he felt the sharp, painful sting of another person's sorrow, and it broke his heart. The world began to bleed color back into its veins. The relentless white of winter receded, surrendering patches of dark, damp earth to a sun that held a fragile new warmth. The iron grip of the frost loosened, and the silence of the snow was replaced by the gentle, persistent sound of dripping water from the eaves of the cabin and the distant rush of a newly freed creek. With the thaw came a treacherous mud that sucked at the heels of a man's boots, and with the mud came movement. Spring on the frontier was a restless time. The trails, impassable for months, now softened and opened. With this opening came the wandering men. They were trappers heading down from the mountains with their winter's haul, their face hidden behind wild beards and a deep, weary mistrust. They were traders with pack mules laden with goods, their eyes sharp for profit. They were drifters, men with no past they cared to speak of and no future they could rightly claim, following the scent of work or trouble, whichever came first. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, a world unto itself, now felt exposed. Its isolation, once a shield, was now just a fact of geography. For Clara, the change was unsettling. The quiet intimacy she had come to share with Callum was a delicate thing, a winter bloom. She feared it could not survive the harsh light of the returning world. Their supply of flour and salt was running low, and one bright, cool morning, Callum announced he was riding into the settlement. He hesitated at the door, his hand on the latch. "You could come," he said, not quite looking at her. "See a new face or two. Mr. Abernathy would be glad to see you are well." Clara's heart gave a nervous flutter. The thought of facing the town again, the memory of their pity and suspicion, was a cold knot in her stomach. But the thought of being left alone in the cabin all day was somehow worse. She had grown accustomed to the quiet weight of his presence. "I will come," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The ride into the settlement was slow, the trail a quagmire of mud and melting snow. Clara sat atop Delilah the mule, while Callum rode his steady bay gelding. He did not speak much on the journey, but he stayed close, his horse's flank sometimes brushing against her leg, a small, reassuring point of contact in the vast, open landscape. Mr. Abernathy's store was crowded. The arrival of spring had brought everyone out from their winter hibernation. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, chewing tobacco, and the collective relief of survival. As Clara entered behind Callum, a hush fell over the room. Conversations stuttered and died. All eyes turned to them. She saw them take in the sight. Callum Hayes, the outcast, the strange man from the mountains, and, beside him, a young woman, her face pale but her cheeks flushed from the cold air, wearing a simple calico dress she had sewn from a bolt of fabric Callum had traded for. They were standing together, a unit, and the town did not know what to make of it. Mr. Abernathy broke the silence, his welcome a little too loud, a little too hearty. "Callum, ma'am, good to see you both. A hard winter, but we made it through." While Callum conducted his business with the shopkeeper, trading several fine fox pelts for supplies, Clara stood near the door, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes. She pretended to examine a display of ribbons, her fingers tracing patterns she did not see. It was the men who watched her most openly. Their gazes were heavy, appraising, lingering on her face, her hair, her hands. They nudged each other, their whispers a low, malevolent buzz just beneath the surface of the room's noise. She tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the familiar, comforting smells of the store, but their stares were like hands on her, and she felt a hot wave of shame wash over her. She was an object of speculation, a puzzle to be solved. As she and Callum were preparing to leave, their supplies packed onto the mule, she stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. 2 trappers were hunkered down by the wall, sharing a pipe. They did not see her at first. "That's the one," one of them muttered, his voice a low growl. The one living out at the Hayes place. Aye, the other one said, spitting a stream of brown juice near his boot. Heard her husband died on the trail. Now she keeps house for Hayes. Convenient. The first man chuckled. A mean, scraping sound. More than his house, I reckon. A man gets lonely through a Montana winter. Wonder what he paid for her. The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. A roaring filled her ears, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Bought woman. The phrase was a brand, searing itself into her mind. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She turned and fled to where Callum was tying the last of the bags, her face a mask of pale horror. He saw her expression, and his own face darkened, a storm gathering in his eyes. He knew. He had not heard the words, but he had seen the looks, felt the shift in the air. He understood the venom of a small town's gossip better than anyone. He said nothing on the long ride back to the cabin. His silence was different this time. It was not peaceful. It was a tight, coiled thing, vibrating with a rage he held in check. Clara rode with her head bowed, the cruel words echoing in her mind, each hoofbeat of the mule pounding them deeper into her heart. The following Sunday, driven by a desperate need for a semblance of normalcy, of piety, Clara decided to go to the small log church in the settlement. She had a deep, if troubled, faith, and she felt a yearning for the comfort of scripture and prayer. Callum did not go to church, but he did not stop her. He simply saddled Delilah for her, his expression grim. Folks can be cruelest in the house of God, he warned, his voice low. She wished she had heeded his warning. From the moment she stepped inside, she felt the chill. It was not the air. The stove in the corner was glowing red. It was the people, the stiff silence that greeted her, the sidelong glances from behind hymn books, the way families shuffled closer together on the rough-hewn benches, leaving a wide, empty space around her, as if she carried a contagion. The preacher's sermon was on the sins of the flesh, on the temptations that lead good people astray. He seemed to look directly at her as he spoke of fallen women, of the snares of wickedness. Clara sat with her back straight, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church. She felt her skin burn, her shame a heavy cloak she could not shrug off. After the service, as the small congregation filed out, she overheard a woman whispering to her friend, her voice sharp with a self-righteous bitterness. Look at her. Not an ounce of shame. That's the kind of girl my Henry left me for. Young, pretty, and no morals to speak of. The words were a final, devastating blow. Clara fled, not waiting to speak to anyone. She untied Delilah and rode away from the town as fast as the mule would carry her, tears of humiliation and rage blurring the muddy trail before her. She found Callum chopping wood, the steady, violent rhythm of his work a release for his own frustrations. He stopped when he saw her face, the axe resting in his hand. He saw the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks, the raw pain in her eyes. I can go into town, he said, his voice a low growl. I can talk to them, set things straight. Clara slid off the mule, her body trembling. She looked at him, at his fierce, protective anger, an anger he was willing to unleash on her behalf, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. Her shame was still there, a raw and tender wound, but a new feeling rose to meet it, a stubborn, defiant loyalty. They had judged him, too. They had cast him out. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin in the eyes of the world. No, she said, and her voice, though quiet, was steady. She walked closer to him, stopping just a few feet away. She lifted her chin and met his stormy gaze. I am not ashamed of you, Callum. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. It was a declaration, an alignment. She was no longer just the lost woman he had taken in. She was his ally. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, but she saw something flicker in the depths of his eyes. Surprise, And something else, something softer. He gave a single, sharp nod, and then he turned back to his work, swinging the axe with a force that split the log in two with one clean blow. Their closeness, forged in the isolation of winter, deepened in the face of the world's disdain. They were a fortress of two. The small cabin was their refuge, the world outside a hostile territory. The unspoken tension between them grew, a fine, high wire of awareness that stretched through the quiet hours. One afternoon, she was chopping carrots for the evening stew, her mind wandering. The knife was sharper than she was used to. It slipped, laying open a deep, clean slice across the palm of her hand. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath more from surprise than pain. Blood welled up, bright red against her skin. Callum was across the room in 2 long strides. He took her hand in his touch surprisingly gentle. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice low and firm. He led her to the water basin and carefully washed the wound, his large, rough thumb stroking away the blood. His touch was electric. Every nerve in her body seemed to leap to attention. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the clean, masculine scent of his skin. He wrapped a clean strip of linen around her hand, his movements efficient and sure. When he was done, his hand lingered, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her inner wrist. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, turning her face slightly toward his calloused palm. It was an instinct, a silent confession of her need for his comfort, his strength, his closeness. He froze, his fingers still against her skin. He looked down at her face tilted trustingly toward him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. The air grew thick, heavy. He could feel her pulse, a frantic bird beating against his thumb. He lifted his other hand, as if to touch her face, his fingers trembling slightly. Then, as if burned, he dropped her hand and stepped back, turning away from her and running a hand through his own hair. "Be more careful," he said, his voice tight and strained. He walked out of the cabin without another word, leaving her standing by the basin, her heart hammering against her ribs, the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. That night, the tension was unbearable. They ate in silence, the air crackling with everything that had been left unsaid, unfelt. After the meal, as Callum was staring into the fire, lost in his own troubled thoughts, Clara could bear it no longer. She had to know. She had to understand the wall he kept between them, a wall that seemed to grow higher every time they came close to breaching it. She rose from her chair and walked over to him. He did not look up as she approached. She stood beside his chair, her hands clasped before her. Finally, she reached out and laid a tentative hand on his arm. The muscles beneath his flannel shirt were hard as rock. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. "Callum," she began, her voice a soft whisper. "You have been kind to me, kinder than anyone has ever been, but you do not have to keep pretending to want me here. If I am a burden, if my presence brings you trouble, you only have to say the word. I will leave." He turned his head slowly and looked at her. In the flickering firelight, she saw a raw anguish in his eyes, a deep and profound sorrow that startled her. He turned away again, his gaze fixed on the flames, his jaw tight. "I am not pretending," he whispered, the words so low she barely heard them. Her breath caught in her throat. She moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to look at her. The space between them was almost non-existent. She could see the flicker of the fire reflected in his stormy eyes. She could feel the heat of his body. She raised her hand and gently touched his cheek, his skin rough with a day's worth of stubble. "Then what is it?" she whispered. "What are you so afraid of?" He did not answer. He simply stared at her, his face a mask of conflict. He leaned forward, closing the last inch between them. His hand came up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her soft hair. His other hand rested on her waist, pulling her closer still. She thought he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to kiss her. She closed her eyes, her lips parting slightly in anticipation. But the kiss never came. With a ragged groan, he pushed himself away from her, rising so abruptly from his chair that it scraped against the floorboards. He strode to the door, his movements stiff and desperate, like a man fleeing a fire. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. Then he was gone, out into the cold, dark night, leaving her alone in the sudden, ringing silence of the cabin. He stood outside, his hands braced against the cold log wall of the cabin, his head bowed. The crisp night air did nothing to cool the turmoil inside him. He had almost given in. He had almost destroyed her, just as he had destroyed the last woman he had allowed himself to love. Images splintered in his mind, sharp and painful as shards of glass. A woman's face, not Clara's, a woman with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes that laughed even when she was sad. Her name was Elspeth. She had been the wife of the rancher he worked for, a man with a heavy hand and a jealous heart. He remembered the stolen moments in the barn, the hushed conversations, the way her hand had felt in his. It had been an innocent thing, a friendship born of shared loneliness. But it had deepened into something more, something dangerous and beautiful. He had loved her, and she, in her own quiet, desperate way, had loved him back. He remembered the night her husband had found them talking by the stables. The man's face, twisted with drink and rage. The accusations, vile and untrue. The struggle. He remembered Elspeth, trying to get between them, her voice pleading. He remembered the hayloft, the misplaced step in the darkness, her surprised cry as she fell. He had knelt beside her broken body, the smell of hay and blood filling his senses. Her husband, sobered by the horror, had started screaming. He had screamed that Callum had pushed her, that he had killed her after trying to force himself on her. The town, eager for a villain, had believed the grieving husband. They had called Callum an adulterer, a murderer. He had been cleared of the killing. It was ruled an accident. But the other names had stuck. His reputation was destroyed. His heart was shattered, and he had sworn he would never again bring that kind of ruin to a woman's life. He looked back at the warm, yellow light of the cabin window. Clara was in there. She was good and decent, and she was starting to look at him with a light in her eyes that he recognized, a light he did not deserve. The town was already calling her his bought woman. If he gave in to the fierce, desperate yearning in his own soul, he would only prove them right. He would tarnish her name forever, tying her to his own disgraced past. He could not do that. He would not. He was not just afraid of his own guilt. He was terrified of what his love could do to her. The days that followed his abrupt departure into the night were quiet, but of a different sort. The fragile tension had been broken, replaced by a deep, melancholic ache that settled over the cabin like a low-lying fog. Callum was more withdrawn than ever, his silence now laced with a sorrow so profound that Clara could feel it across the room. He worked with a grim, punishing intensity, as if trying to exhaust a demon from his body. He avoided her eyes, and if their hands brushed while passing the salt or a log for the fire, he would pull away as if he had been burned. Clara gave him his space. She understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that his retreat was not about her. It was about a ghost from his past, a wound so deep that her touch had somehow torn it open again. She did not press him. She simply continued her quiet work, mending and cooking and tending to the small world of the cabin. Her presence, a steady, unspoken question he was not yet ready to answer. She was patient. The frontier had taught her, if nothing else, the grueling art of endurance. The end came on a deceptively beautiful afternoon. The sky was a high, brilliant blue, and the air held the sweet, loamy scent of thawing earth. Clara was in the small lean-to that served as a barn. brushing the thick winter coat from Delilah the mule. When she heard them, it was the sound of multiple horses, not ambling, but riding with a hard, deliberate purpose. It was a sound of men. She peeked through a crack in the rough-hewn wall. 4 riders were cresting the low ridge that led to the cabin. They were not trappers or traders. They sat tall in their saddles, rifles resting easy across their laps, their faces hard and set with a grim resolve. They moved like a pack, a single entity with a single mind. A cold dread washed over her. She saw Callum emerge from the cabin, a bucket in his hand. He stopped dead when he saw the riders, his body going unnaturally still. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this day for a very long time. He set the bucket down slowly, deliberately, and waited. "Clara!" His voice was low, but it carried to her in the still air, sharp with an urgency she had never heard before. "Go into the barn, get in the loft, and do not make a sound. Do you understand?" She did not hesitate. His tone left no room for questions. She scrambled up the rickety ladder to the small hayloft, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She burrowed into the loose, sweet-smelling hay, finding a place where a gap between the logs afforded her a narrow, fractured view of the clearing in front of the cabin. The 4 riders reined in their horses a few yards from where Callum stood. The man in the lead was older, with a beard streaked gray and eyes as cold and flat as river stones. He was the one who spoke, his voice carrying an unnerving authority. "Callum Hayes," the man said. It was not a question. Callum said nothing. He just stood there, his hands loose at his sides, his face a mask of stoic resignation. "We've come a long way to find you," the man continued, his horse shifting restlessly beneath him. "A long way to see justice done." "There is no justice here for you, Silas," Callum said, his voice level. "Only me." The man named Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That's where you are wrong. Justice is what we have come to collect, for Amos Croft." The name meant nothing to Clara, but she saw a flicker of something, pain, memory, guilt, cross Callum's face before the mask slammed back into place. "Amos Croft has been dead for 5 years," Callum stated. "Aye," Silas agreed, leaning forward in his saddle. 5 years since you put him in the ground. We heard you ran up here after you killed Elspeth's husband. After you killed Amos, the folks down at the Double Horn, they never forgot. They said you got away with it. We are here to tell you that the debt has come due." Clara's blood ran cold. Killed Elspeth's husband. The name, Elspeth. It was the woman from his past, the ghost that haunted him. But they were twisting the story, contorting it into a monstrous lie. She knew, with every fiber of her being, that Callum was not a murderer. But the men in front of the cabin believed he was. They had come not for a trial, but for a reckoning. "You have it wrong," Callum said, his voice weary, as if he had already had this argument 1,000 times in his own mind. "Amos died in a saloon brawl in Dusty Creek, a knife fight over a card game. I was 50 miles away, riding the North Pasture." "A convenient story," one of the other men sneered. "Everyone knows you and Croft hated each other. He was sweet on Elspeth, same as you. And after she died, he was the one who told everyone what you were. He was the one who wanted to see you hang." "So you killed him to shut him up," Silas concluded, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "We are here to finish what the law was too cowardly to start. We are a committee of vigilance. Hayes, and we find you guilty." Clara watched in horror as the men dismounted, their movements slow and predatory. They were going to kill him, and Callum was just standing there, a statue carved from granite and regret, ready to accept their verdict. The need to do something, anything, was a physical force inside her. She scrambled down the ladder, her movements clumsy in her haste. She had to get to him, to make him fight, to make him deny their lies with the force they deserved. She burst out of the barn door, her skirts catching on the splintered frame. "Callum!" she cried, her voice thin and desperate. He turned his head, and for a fleeting moment, a look of pure anguish crossed his face. It was not fear for himself, but for her. "Clara, I told you to stay put," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. Silas and his men stopped, turning to look at her. Their eyes raked over her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Well, what have we here?" Silas drawled. "The little widow. We heard about you in town. Found yourself another man quick enough, did you not?" The insult barely registered. Her focus was entirely on Callum, on the terrible, fatalistic calm in his eyes. She ran to him, grabbing his arm, her fingers digging into the hard muscle. "Tell them," she begged, her voice a frantic whisper. "Tell them it is a lie. You have to fight them. Callum, you cannot just let them do this." He looked down at her, and his expression softened into one of profound sorrow. He gently disentangled her fingers from his arm. "It does not matter what I say." "Clara," he said, his voice so quiet only she could hear it. "Their minds are made up. It was made up 5 years ago." "But it is not right," she insisted, tears of frustration and terror welling in her eyes. "You cannot let them win. You did nothing wrong." He put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was both a comfort and a dismissal. "I already lost everything once, a long time ago," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his past. He looked at her then, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were trying to memorize her face. You deserve a man without blood on his hands." And then he pushed her gently but firmly away from him, toward the cabin door. "Go inside. Do not watch this." He turned back to face the 4 men, his shoulders squared, his fate accepted. But Clara did not go inside. His words had not been a comfort. They had been a knife to her heart. You deserve a man without blood on his hands. He was deciding for her. He was choosing his own punishment, his own guilt, over any possibility of a life with her. He was sacrificing himself to a lie, and in doing so, he was sacrificing her, too. A fire ignited inside her, a blaze of pure, defiant rage that burned away every last trace of her fear. He did not get to decide what she deserved. He did not get to choose this ending. She had been a passive victim of fate for too long, a daughter bartered in marriage, a bride widowed by sickness, a stray pitied by a town of strangers. No more. She turned and ran, not into the cabin, but back into the barn. Her eyes scanned the familiar, dusty interior. On a set of pegs on the wall hung Callum's spare rifle. She had watched him clean it 100 times. She knew how it worked. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely lift it. It was heavy, a cold, awkward weight in her arms. She checked it as she had seen him do. It was loaded. She walked back out into the clearing, the rifle held before her. The 4 men were advancing on Callum, who stood, unmoving, his hands still at his sides. They stopped when they saw her, their expressions of contempt turning to disbelief. "Put that thing down, little girl," Silas sneered, though he did not move any closer. "You do not want to get involved in this?" "She is already involved," Clara said, her voice trembling but clear, ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. She planted her feet in the mud, holding the rifle as steady as she could. It was pointed at the ground, halfway between her and them, but the threat was unmistakable. Callum stared at her, his face a mixture of shock, horror, and a dawning, reluctant admiration. "Clara, no," he said, his voice strained. She ignored him, her eyes locked on Silas. "You have it all wrong," she said, her voice gaining in volume and confidence. "He did not steal any cattle, and he did not kill that man. He was protecting a woman whose husband was a cruel man. He was trying to save her." Her words were a gamble, a patchwork of truth stitched together from the letters she had read, the pain in Callum's eyes, and her own unwavering faith in his character. He was her friend when no one else was, she continued, her voice rising with passion. He tried to save her from a miserable life and from a husband who hurt her, and she died anyway. It was an accident, and he has been paying for it every single day since. Her raw, unshakable conviction gave the men pause. This was not the story they had been telling themselves for 5 years. This was not a tale of a common thief and a murderer. This was something else, something more complicated. Her courage. The sight of this small, determined woman standing between them and their prey with a rifle in her shaking hands had broken their momentum. They hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. It was in that moment of hesitation that another sound broke the tense silence, the sound of a single horse, approaching at a gallop. A moment later, the sheriff from the settlement rode into the clearing, reining his horse to a dramatic halt. He was a portly man with a weathered face and shrewd, intelligent eyes. He took in the scene in an instant. The 4 armed men, Callum standing alone and unarmed, and the woman with the rifle. "Silas," the sheriff said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "What is the meaning of this? I heard in town you and your boys were riding out this way. This looks an awful lot like a lynching party." Silas straightened up, trying to regain his air of authority. "This is private business. Sheriff, we are a committee of vigilance, here to see justice done for a crime the law ignored." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "I am the law here, and I do not recognize any committees. I know all about the stories surrounding Amos Croft's death, and I know they are just that, stories. You have no proof, no warrant, and no authority. All you have is a 5-year-old grudge. Now, I suggest you and your men mount up and ride out of here before I decide to arrest you all for armed intimidation and conspiracy." Silas glared at the sheriff, then at Callum, and finally at Clara. His face was a mask of frustrated fury. He had been thwarted, not by the man he had come to kill, but by a woman and a lawman. He spat on the ground. "This is not over! Hayes!" he snarled. He and his men mounted their horses. They gave Clara one last, venomous look, and then they wheeled their horses around and rode away, their fury a palpable thing in the air behind them. The clearing was suddenly, profoundly silent. The sheriff looked from Callum to Clara, who was still holding the rifle, her arms trembling from the strain. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He nodded toward Callum. "You might be the first person to ever stand up for this man." He tipped his hat. "Callum, try to stay out of trouble." With that, he turned his horse and trotted away, leaving them alone in the aftermath. The adrenaline drained out of Clara, leaving her weak and shaking. The heavy rifle slipped from her grasp, thudding softly into the mud. She stared at the spot where the riders had been, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Callum was looking at her, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions: shock, gratitude, fear, and a profound, heart-stopping tenderness. He took a step toward her, then another. He stopped in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to look at him. "You should not have done that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They could have hurt you." Clara lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with the last embers of her anger. "And you should not have been so ready to die," she retorted, her voice shaking. "You should not have been so willing to let them kill you for a crime you did not commit." She took a breath, her gaze unwavering. "You do not get to decide what I deserve, Callum Hayes," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, intense whisper. "You do not get to use your guilt as a shield to push me away. My life is my own, and I decide who is worthy of it." And then, before he could answer, before he could retreat behind his walls of silence and sorrow, she rose up on her tiptoes, put her hands on his shoulders, and she kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss or a questioning one. It was a kiss of defiance, of ownership, of a choice being made. It was slow and deliberate, a statement of fact. She poured all of her fear, all of her anger, and all of her fierce, blossoming love into it. For a moment, he remained perfectly still. rigid with shock. She felt the conflict in him, the war between his past and his present, and then, with a low groan that was half surrender and half prayer, he yielded. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against his chest, one hand tangling in her hair, the other pressing into the small of her back, and he finally let himself kiss her back. It was a kiss of agonizing tenderness, of a gratitude so profound it felt like a dam breaking, of a man who had been starving for a lifetime finally allowing himself to be fed. The world fell away, and in the quiet clearing, under the vast Montana sky, there was only the two of them, finally claiming a truth that was stronger than any lie. That kiss was a frontier, a line drawn in the mud between the past and the present. In the weeks that followed, they began to explore the new country of each other, not with words, but with a quiet, unfolding tenderness. The oppressive tension that had filled the cabin was gone, replaced by an ease so profound it felt as if they had been breathing shallowly for months and could finally draw a full, deep breath. They lived quietly. The rhythm of their days was still dictated by the hard work of survival, but now it was a shared labor, a partnership. Clara discovered a small, fallow patch of earth behind the cabin, protected from the wind by a stand of aspens. With a spade and a hoe Callum repaired for her, she began to turn the soil. She planted the few seeds she could get from Mr. Abernathy, beans, squash, and hardy greens. Tending the garden became her private ritual, with her hands in the cool, dark earth. She felt as if she were planting roots of her own, coaxing life from a place that had once promised only a frozen death. She was no longer just a resident of the cabin. She was becoming a part of the land itself. Callum watched her. While he was splitting logs or repairing a harness, his gaze would drift to her small, determined figure bent over the nascent rows of green. He saw the contentment on her face, the way the sun brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, and he began a project of his own. Using the fine, straight-grained wood from a fallen pine, he started building a bench. He worked on it in the evenings, after the chores were done, his hands, which could be so strong and rough, moving with a surprising precision and care. He did not tell her what it was for. She simply watched, intrigued, as the simple seat took shape. When it was finished, smooth and sturdy, he placed it on the small, rough porch of the cabin, facing west toward the mountains. "For your letters," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A woman needs a place to think her thoughts." It was, Clara knew, the most romantic thing a man had ever done for her. It was not a gift of flowers or trinkets. It was a gift of understanding. He had seen her need to pour her heart onto the page, and he had built a place for her to do it. He was not just making space for her in his home. He was making space for her soul. But their quiet world could not remain an island forever. The town, and the poison Silas and his men had left behind, was a constant brooding presence on the horizon. The story of what had happened at the Hayes Ranch had traveled fast, but it had become twisted and ugly in the telling. Silas and his men, smarting from their humiliation, had painted a new picture for anyone who would listen. They claimed they had ridden out to question Hayes about his past, and that his woman had met them with a rifle, crazed and hysterical. The narrative shifted. Clara was no longer the pitiable widow who had fallen on hard times. She was a fallen woman, a Jezebel who had taken up with a known outlaw, a woman of loose morals who would defend her keeper with a gun. Callum was no longer just an outcast. He was the man who kept her, a corrupter of a vulnerable widow. Their shared act of defiance had been reframed as a shared act of sin. The next time they rode into the settlement for supplies, the change was palpable. The stares were no longer just curious. They were hard, hostile, and condemning. The women pulled their children closer as Clara passed, their face tight with disapproval. The men watched her with a new, lewd sort of interest, their eyes filled with a knowing contempt. The whispers were no longer hidden. They were a hostile wind that followed her through the dusty street. The church became the crucible for their public shaming. They went together this time, a united front against the town's judgment. They sat in the back, in the same empty space as before, but this time they were not alone in their isolation. They were together. The preacher, a stern man with a face like a clenched fist, delivered a sermon on the sanctity of marriage and the damnation that awaited those who lived in sin. His eyes kept flicking toward them, his words like stones aimed directly at their heads. After the service, as was the custom, families would go to the front to receive a blessing for the week ahead. Callum, seeing the determined set of Clara's jaw, did not protest when she stood and walked toward the altar, pulling him by the hand. They knelt before the preacher, the last in line. He looked down at them, his face a mask of cold piety. He gave a blessing to the family on their right and the family on their left. But when he looked at them, he was silent. He simply stared, his disapproval a palpable force. "Reverend," Callum said, his voice low and dangerous. "A blessing." The preacher drew himself up. "The Lord does not bless a household of iniquity," he said, his voice ringing through the suddenly silent church. "When you have sanctified your union in the eyes of God and man, then you may ask for His grace. Until then, I suggest you pray for the forgiveness of your souls." He turned his back on them, a final, public act of dismissal. A gasp went through the remaining congregation, followed by a low murmur of vindicated gossip. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Clara. She felt Callum tense beside her, a coiled spring of rage. She put her hand on his arm, her grip tight, and pulled him to his feet. They walked out of the church, their heads held high, the weight of 100 self-righteous eyes on their backs. They did not speak on the ride home. When they reached the cabin, Clara slid from the mule's back and stood for a long moment, looking up at the vast, indifferent sky. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet, but shaking with a fierce, wounded anger. "Why would God punish a love that was born from one person saving another? We have been nothing but good to each other. We have survived. Is that a sin, to survive, and to find comfort in another soul who has done the same?" Callum came to stand beside her. He had no answers for her questions about God. The world had taught him that divinity was a distant, silent thing, and that salvation was found only in the strength of one's own hands. But he understood the heart of her question. "It is not God who is punishing us, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "It is them. They are afraid. A woman who does not need their pity, a man who does not need their forgiveness. It frightens them. So they call it a sin. It is easier than admitting they were wrong." His words did not soothe the hurt, but they clarified it. It was not a divine judgment they faced, but a human one. And human judgment, she was beginning to learn, was often a thing of profound and terrible cruelty. A week later, the sky, which had been a clear and promising blue, turned a bruised, sullen gray. A late spring blizzard, a final, spiteful blast from a dying winter, swept down from the mountains with a shocking ferocity. The temperature plummeted, and a wind that carried the razor-sharp sting of ice screamed through the pines. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding sheet that erased the world. They were safe in the cabin, the fire roaring, the log walls a sturdy defense against the storm's fury. But as night began to fall, there was a frantic pounding on the door. Callum opened it to a gust of wind and snow, and a man, his face nearly frozen, his clothes covered in ice. It was Jacob Miller, a farmer from a homestead a few miles east of the settlement. "My boy," the man gasped, his words tumbling out between chattering teeth. "My Daniel. He went out this afternoon to check the fences before the storm hit. He is only 10. He has not come back. The wife is beside herself. I have been searching for hours. I cannot find him." Clara's heart seized. A 10-year-old boy, lost in this. Callum did not waste a moment. "Get in by the fire," he told the frantic father. "Clara, get the horses ready. The big blankets, the whiskey, the lantern. He moved with an urgent, focused energy. There were no questions, no hesitation. A child was in danger. Nothing else mattered. As Clara rushed to the barn, bundling the necessary supplies, she realized that Jacob Miller's wife, Sarah, was one of the women who had looked at her with the most disdain in church, who had whispered most loudly about her fallen state. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth, but it was quickly washed away by the urgency of the moment. They rode out into the heart of the maelstrom, Callum on his gelding, leading the way with a lantern held high, its light a small, fragile beacon in the swirling white chaos. Clara followed on Delilah, her head bowed against the stinging wind. It was like riding into a howling, featureless void. The snow was so thick she could barely see Callum, just the faint, swinging glow of his lamp. "Daniel!" Callum's voice was a roar, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. "Daniel!" Clara screamed, her own voice thin and lost. They rode for what felt like an eternity, their bodies growing numb with cold, their hope beginning to freeze and crack. The storm was a living thing, a malevolent entity that sought to confuse and defeat them. They were searching for a small boy in an infinite expanse of white death. It was Callum who found the tracks, a faint set of small boot prints, nearly erased, leading away from the fence line and into a small, wooded ravine. He dismounted, handing the lantern to Clara. He followed the tracks on foot, his big body a dark shape against the snow. He disappeared into the trees. Clara waited, her heart a frozen lump in her chest, the world a chaos of wind and snow and the terrified thumping of her own blood in her ears. He emerged a few minutes later, a small, limp form bundled in his arms. They brought the boy back to the cabin. He was alive, but only just. His skin was a frightening, waxy blue, his breathing shallow. Jacob Miller let out a choked sob of relief and grief. A few minutes later, the boy's mother, Sarah, arrived, having followed her husband's tracks, her face a mask of raw terror. Clara took charge. The clumsy, hesitant woman who had arrived at the cabin months ago was gone. In her place was a woman of quiet, determined competence. "Get these wet clothes off him," she commanded, her voice steady. "Callum, heat the blankets by the fire. Mr. Miller, rub his feet. Hard. We have to get the blood moving." She worked tirelessly, rubbing the boy's frozen limbs, forcing sips of warm, sweet broth between his blue lips. Sarah Miller stood by, wringing her hands, her eyes wide with a helpless terror. She was one of the town's righteous matrons, but in the face of this crisis, she was just a frightened mother, and it was the fallen woman who was saving her son's life. Callum moved to the mother's side. He put a large, comforting hand on her shoulder. "He is strong," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "Clara knows what she is doing. He is in good hands." He stood with her, a silent pillar of strength, comforting the woman whose gossip had caused them so much pain, while Clara fought to bring her son back from the brink. All through the long, dark night, Clara sat by the boy's side, never leaving him. She bathed his face with a warm cloth, whispered soothing words to him, and held his small, cold hand in hers. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the boy's fever had broken. A faint touch of pink had returned to his cheeks, and his breathing was deep and even. He was going to live. Sarah Miller fell to her knees beside the cot, weeping with a gratitude so profound it was painful to watch. She looked up at Clara, her eyes swimming with tears. I do not know how to thank you," she stammered. The things we said, I was wrong. I am so sorry." Clara was too exhausted to feel any sense of triumph. She simply nodded, a deep weariness in her bones. "He is a good boy," she said quietly. "I am glad he is safe." The Millers left soon after, carrying their sleeping son, their gratitude and shame a palpable thing in the air. The story of what had happened spread through the settlement as quickly as the gossip once had. Not everyone was swayed. Some remained cold, suspicious. But for many, something had shifted. They had been so quick to judge, so eager to condemn. And when a true crisis had come, it was the outcasts, the sinners, who had ridden into the storm without a moment's hesitation. The town's view of Callum and Clara began to change, from a hard, unyielding judgment to a grudging, hesitant respect. That night, the cabin was quiet again. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, gentle glow over the room. Callum sat in his chair, staring into the flames, the events of the last 24 hours etched on his face. Clara was bone-weary, her body aching with fatigue, her spirit drained. She had faced down armed men. She had stared into the teeth of a blizzard. She had fought for a child's life. She had been strong. She walked over to him and sank to the floor, resting her head against his knees, a gesture of pure, unadorned exhaustion. He began to stroke her hair, his touch infinitely gentle. She closed her eyes, letting the simple comfort of his touch wash over her. "I do not want to be strong tonight," she whispered, her voice muffled against the rough fabric of his trousers. "I just want to be loved." He stopped stroking her hair. He put his hand under her chin and gently tilted her face up to his. In the soft firelight, he saw the deep weariness in her eyes, the vulnerability she so rarely allowed to show. This was not the defiant woman with the rifle, or the competent woman who had saved a child's life. This was just Clara, a woman who was tired of fighting, a woman who simply wanted to be held. He stood, pulling her up with him. He did not speak. He did not need to. He led her to his bed, the one built into the wall, the one she had never entered. He pulled back the heavy blankets and quilts, and she slipped between the cool sheets. The bed was small, and it smelled of him, of clean linen and wood smoke and the faint, masculine scent of his skin. It smelled like safety. He undressed in the firelight and slid in beside her. He pulled her against him, her back to his chest, his arm wrapping securely around her waist. She sighed, a long, shuddering release of all the tension, all the fear, all the strength she had been holding inside for so long. He held her like that for a long time, their bodies fitting together as if they were made for it, their breathing slowly falling into the same rhythm. There was no desperate passion, no frantic urgency. It was a coming together that was as quiet and as natural as the turning of the seasons. It was tender and slow, and filled with a profound and quiet need. It was two solitary souls, two survivors, finally finding their harbor, in his arms, in the warmth of his bed, in the deep, quiet peace of the cabin. Clara was no longer strong. She was simply, finally, loved. And for the first time since she had left Ohio, she felt like she was home. The fragile peace they had built was a living thing, as real and as tangible as the green shoots pushing their way through the dark soil of Clara's garden. The days were a quiet communion, a language spoken not in words, but in shared rhythms and gentle gestures. She would be on her knees, her hands deep in the earth, and she would feel his eyes on her from the wood pile, a look of such profound, quiet contentment that it warmed her more than the spring sun. He would come in from the stables, his hands chapped and smelling of horse and leather, and she would have a mug of hot coffee waiting for him, their fingers brushing as he took it from her. They were healing, not just from their own separate pasts, but from the raw, open wound of their shared loneliness. They slept in his bed every night, their bodies learning the contours of each other, finding a deep and dreamless rest in the simple, solid comfort of the other's presence. It was a love that had been forged in the crucible of winter and violence, and it had a strength that was quiet, but unbreakable. The ghosts that had haunted the cabin had fled, banished by the steady, unassuming light of their affection. But the world outside their small patch of land had a long memory and a bitter heart. The tentative respect they had earned from some in the settlement had done little to quell the venom of Silas and his men. Their humiliation had festered, curdling into a dark and obsessive hatred. They had lost their public standing, but in the dark corners of the saloon, they nurtured their grudge, feeding it with whiskey and whispered lies. They had been denied their frontier justice, and it was an insult their pride could not endure. Trouble returned, as it always does, under the cloak of a moonless night. Clara was jolted from a deep sleep by a sound that did not belong, the nervous, frantic whinny of a horse from the barn. She sat up, her heart instantly beginning to pound. Beside her, Callum was already awake, his body tense and still, listening. Then she saw it, a faint, unnatural orange light flickering against the cabin wall, dancing and pulsing with a malevolent energy. "Fire!" Callum breathed, the word a harsh whisper in the dark. He was out of the bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and boots with a swift, desperate urgency. But as he reached for the door, Clara's hand shot out and grabbed his arm. Her eyes were wide, not with the panicked fear of a victim, but with the sharp, cold clarity of a soldier. "No," she said, her voice low and steady. "They will be waiting for you. It is a trap." She was right. They did not just want to burn his barn. They wanted him. They wanted to draw him out into the open. The memory of their last encounter, of their rifles and their cold, hard eyes, was seared into her mind. Before he could argue, she was out of the bed, her bare feet silent on the cool wood floor. She did not reach for a dress. She reached for the rifle that was always kept, loaded, on the pegs by the door. The cold, heavy weight of it was familiar in her hands now, an extension of her own will. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for debate. "Bar the door behind me. I will go out the back." "Clara, that is madness," he protested, his face a mask of fear for her. She turned to him, and in the flickering, hellish light from the window, he saw the woman she had become. The trembling, lost girl he had found in the snow was gone forever. In her place was a woman of iron and fire. "The madness," she said, her voice tight with conviction, "was thinking they would just leave us be. They want to fight, Callum, but they will not get the one they are expecting." She slipped out the back door into the cold night air. The long flannel shirt she wore as a nightgown, providing little protection against the chill. She did not feel it. Her blood was pumping with a hot, focused rage. She moved silently along the back of the cabin, using the deep shadows as cover, the heavy rifle held ready in her hands. She rounded the corner and saw them. It was Silas and two of his men. They had thrown torches onto the dry roof of the barn, and the flames were just beginning to lick at the old, weathered shingles. They were not watching the barn. They were watching the front door of the cabin, their rifles raised, their faces illuminated by the firelight, twisted with a sick, eager anticipation. Clara raised the rifle to her shoulder, bracing it as he had shown her. She did not aim at any of them. She aimed at the dark space just above their heads, at the trunk of a large pine tree. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was a deafening crack that ripped through the night, a thunderclap of defiance. It echoed off the mountainside, a declaration that the prey was fighting back. Splinters of bark exploded from the tree, and the three men cried out in shock, spinning around, their eyes wide and searching in the darkness. "Get off this land!" Clara's voice rang out, clear and cold as a river stone. "Get off this land, or the next one will not be a warning." For a moment, they were frozen, stunned to see the woman, not the man, standing there in the shadows, a rifle in her hands. Then Silas's shock curdled into a new, more vicious rage. He had been thwarted by this woman once before. It would not happen again. "It is the witch!" he snarled. "Get her!" While the other two men hesitated, Silas lunged, moving with a surprising speed. He crossed the space between them before Clara could react, before she could even think to chamber another round. He grabbed the front of her shirt, his other hand seizing the rifle, twisting it brutally from her grasp. It fell to the ground with a thud. He slammed her back against the rough log wall of the cabin, his face inches from hers, his breath a foul wave of whiskey and hate. "You have been nothing but trouble since you got here," he hissed, his fingers digging into her arms. "You and your murdering keeper. I should have dealt with you then. I will deal with you now." His threat hung in the air, vile and terrifying. But as his hand tightened on her, the front door of the cabin burst open. Callum was a roar of pure, primal fury. He was not a man anymore. He was an avenging force of nature. He hit the first of Silas's men with the force of a battering ram, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The second man raised his rifle, but Callum was too fast. He grabbed the barrel, wrenching it away, and used the man's own momentum to throw him to the ground. Then he turned to Silas. The look in Callum's eyes was terrifying, a promise of a violence so absolute it made Silas instinctively recoil, his grip on Clara loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Callum needed. He launched himself at Silas, pulling him off of Clara and throwing him to the ground. The two men grappled in the dirt, a desperate, brutal fight illuminated by the growing flames from the barn roof. It was a fight of fists and knees and raw, unrestrained rage. Callum was stronger, but Silas was wiry and desperate, fighting like a cornered animal. Clara, gasping for breath, her back scraped and bruised against the logs, scrambled for the fallen rifle. Her hands closed around the smooth, cool wood of the stock. She got to her feet just as Silas managed to land a vicious blow to Callum's head, stunning him. Silas scrambled on top of him, his hands reaching for Callum's throat. Clara did not scream. She did not hesitate. She did not think. She acted. She reversed the rifle in her hands, holding it like a club. She took 2 steps forward and brought the heavy, solid butt of the rifle down with all of her strength onto the side of Silas's head. There was a sickening, dull crack. Silas went rigid, his eyes rolling back in his head. He collapsed sideways, a dead weight on top of Callum. The other 2 men, who had been scrambling to their feet, froze. They stared at Silas's unconscious form, then at the woman standing over him, the rifle held in her hands, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing in the firelight. The fight was gone from them. They had come for a man, but they had been defeated by a woman. They turned and fled into the darkness, crashing through the underbrush like panicked deer. Callum pushed Silas's limp body off of him and staggered to his feet. He went to Clara, his hands reaching for her, his eyes searching her face, her arms, her body for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with a terrified concern. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head, the rifle still clutched in her hands. She was trembling, a violent, full-body tremor, a reaction to the adrenaline and the violence. But as she looked at him, her eyes were perfectly clear. There was no terror in them. There was no panic. The fear was gone. She had met the worst the world had to offer, and she had not broken. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against him, his face buried in her hair. "The barn," she whispered against his chest. Together, they worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm, using buckets of water from the creek to douse the flames. The fire had not yet taken full hold, and they managed to extinguish it, leaving a blackened, smoldering patch on the roof as a scar, a reminder of the night's violence. When it was over, they stood in the pre-dawn light, covered in soot and water, their bodies aching. It was then that the sheriff arrived, a grim expression on his face. One of the fleeing men, it turned out, had run straight into a patrol the sheriff had set up after hearing rumors of trouble brewing in town. The sheriff took in the scene, the scorched barn. Silas is unconscious but breathing form on the ground, the deep bruises already forming on Callum's face, and the woman who stood beside him, exhausted but unbroken. He listened to their story, his expression growing harder with every word. He looked at the evidence, at the clear proof of a malicious, premeditated attack. He put Silas in irons, and, after taking a full statement from both Callum and Clara, he turned to Callum. "I have had my doubts about the story they told about you down at the Double Horn for a long time," the sheriff said, his voice thoughtful. "This," he gestured to the scene, "this proves these men are liars, capable of anything to settle a grudge. I think it is high time I rode down there myself and officially reopened the investigation into what really happened to Amos Croft and Elspeth's husband." In the weeks that followed, a fragile quiet returned, but this time it was a quiet filled with hope. The sheriff was true to his word. He uncovered a web of lies and old perjuries, finding a witness who had been too afraid to speak years ago, a man who confirmed that Amos Croft had died exactly as Callum had said, in a drunken brawl 50 miles away. He found proof that Elspeth's husband had been a violent, jealous man who had terrorized his wife. Callum's name, tarnished by 5 years of lies and suspicion, was finally, officially, cleared. The news changed everything. The people of the settlement, faced with the undeniable truth of his innocence and the clear villainy of his accusers, began to treat them with a new, hesitant respect. The Millers were the first, stopping by the cabin with a freshly baked pie and an offer of help in repairing the barn roof. Others followed, a gruff nod from a man at the general store, a shy smile from a woman who had once glared. They were no longer the outcasts. They were Callum and Clara, the quiet, strong people from the cabin in the pines who had faced down trouble and won. Clara, in turn, found a new voice. She was no longer the withdrawn, silent woman who had arrived in the winter. She spoke her mind freely, with a quiet confidence that drew people in. When a new family arrived in the territory, the wife left a widow on the trail just as Clara had been. The townspeople brought the woman to her. Clara did not offer pity. She offered practical help, a warm meal, and a connection to a woman who had found a job for her at the settlement. She had become the sanctuary she herself had so desperately needed. She was no longer a lost girl with nowhere to go. She was a harbor. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, Callum and Clara sat together on the bench he had built for her. The air was warm, and the scent of new blossoms and her thriving garden filled the air. Callum was quiet for a long time, his hand covering hers. Finally, he turned to her, his stormy eyes soft and filled with a light she had come to know as love. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, earnest rumble. "When I met you, I was a man living in a prison of his own making. I did not think I deserved a life, or a home, or another person's kindness." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "You walked out into the night and faced down armed men for me. You saved me from them, and you saved me from myself. I do not want to offer you marriage as payment, or as a way to give you protection. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You do not need my protection." He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I am asking you to marry me because I cannot imagine a morning where I do not get to wake up beside you. I am asking because I want to wake up every day and hand you my shirt." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of his strong, kind face. They were not tears of sadness or of pity, but tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the grief, the cold, the fear, the shame. And she thought of this man, this quiet, honorable man who had mended her boot, guarded her nightmares, and given her a place to heal. She said yes with those tears, and with a strength that was forged in the Montana wilderness, and with the vivid, poignant memory of the lost and broken girl she once was. The story ends here, on this rebuilt porch, under the vast and benevolent spring sky. The garden is in full bloom, a testament to a life coaxed from hard ground. Callum is sanding a small rocking chair he is making for the miller's new baby, and Clara is reading aloud from a letter she has just finished, a letter addressed not to her mother or to a friend, but to the girl who stumbled out of a wagon into the snow so many months ago. Her voice is soft, but clear and strong, and it carries on the warm evening air. You will be cold. You will be lost, but someday, someone will give you his shirt, and the world will finally feel warm. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect with one another. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and be sure to share your thoughts with us in English.